Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, foreign aid cuts and new estimations of the impact of those. A new analysis in the Lancet Global Health estimates that up to 22.6 million additional deaths could occur by 2030, including more than 5 million children. Stephanie Desmon is joined by Eric Pelofsky of the Rockefeller Foundation to talk about what's driving these projections and what they could mean for health systems and communities. Let's listen. Eric Pelofsky, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
I wanted to talk today about a recent study, an analysis in the Lancet Global Health that estimated that reductions in foreign aid could lead to as many as 22.6 million additional deaths by 2030 across 93 countries. More than 5 million of those could be children. Could you talk us through how the researchers made that connection between funding and lives lost?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. The ISGlobal data is really startling. And they started with a study at the end of last year as some of these cuts were becoming realities as opposed to threats, and did some retrospective analysis and tried to project it forward. And we were obviously intrigued given all of the work that we do in this area, and also Rockefeller's conviction that you have to be data-driven. And so asked them to continue the work and use some projections forward that were sort of the continued cuts and sort of deeper cuts. And so they did this much larger, more detailed forecast of the implications and came up with, as you said, 22.6 million additional deaths as a result of dramatic cuts. And I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 9.5 million deaths in some of the other scenarios that aren't quite as dramatic. Nonetheless, very dramatic. And of course, we seem to be on the path towards a very dramatic implication. The OECD reported that last year's cuts were at the scale of 23%, which is $40 billion cuts to ODA, which puts us on a really negative path towards those much larger potential deaths as a result of the cuts.
And ODA is?
Official Development Assistance.
In your words, this is startling data. It's happening at a moment because several major countries are reducing or rethinking their foreign aid. Why is this happening now?
I think there are two problems. One is that you've had this surge of nationalism that probably results from both deep frustrations that government isn't delivering domestically in some of the key donor countries. At the same time, the connection in people's mind between foreign assistance and national security has really deteriorated in a dramatic way. And so people no longer see foreign assistance as a way to make them safer, stronger, and more prosperous. They see it as a drain on resources that could be helping them in their domestic needs. And so I think it's a very bad combination of that domestic frustration and, frankly, a deep deterioration of the case for this aid as a way to advance international objectives of the various donor countries.
But foreign aid has been associated with major gains.
Absolutely. And it has also been associated with making the world safer, making the world more stable, making the world more prosperous, building a global economy that actually lifts people out of poverty, building a trade and export markets for countries that, frankly, build economies both in the donor and in the recipient country.
So how real is the risk that we are going to begin to lose some of that progress?
I think the risk is quite real. I think some of that progress was already lost after the COVID, followed by the second pummeling, which was the Ukraine war. And now this Iran war has piled on top of it. So I think in many regards, you have these external shocks combined with dramatic cuts to the official development assistance. The implications for the countries in the developing world are, in some cases, catastrophic. You've lost 2 or 3 decades of progress against poverty.
What kind of programs, particular programs, tend to be most immediately impacted with funding cuts?
I'm genuinely not sure I know that answer from the standpoint of where you see the impact, but obviously the cuts to global health are the ones that have dramatic impacts on the recipient countries and frankly, ultimately affect the entire world. If you have a very unhealthy developing world and you had no airplanes or ships, you might be safe. But in a world that we live in, which is full of airplanes that go everywhere and carry people everywhere and ships that go everywhere, the disease that starts in one place does not stay in that place.
USAID wasn't perfect, but it did provide a lot of resources to a lot of people who had a lot of health needs. Those programs are gone now, for the most part. Is that right?
Many of them are, and in cases we should be clear, Congress did not agree to all of the cuts, and obviously that's a good thing, and, we're hopeful that the money that was appropriated will be spent in the places and for the purposes that it was appropriated, but a lot has gone away, and frankly, the real concern is that in a world where we have sort of a very vibrant conversation about, quote, fraud, waste, and abuse, that many of the safeguards that were built into USAID's procedures, both oversight, anti-diversion safeguards, and a lot of that transparency has also gone away. And so, and of course, all of the people overseeing it have almost entirely gone away. So you have these huge block grants that seem to have been allocated in some cases for health. And one has to hope that the absence of these safeguards won't lead to some of the very concerns that people were talking about of fraud, waste, and abuse. I would really much hope that gives the recipient countries agency, which is obviously a good thing, but that it doesn't also create new opportunities for funds to go missing.
The impact of these cuts is both human and moral, but reflects policy choices. If government funding becomes less predictable, how do institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation think about stepping in or adapting?
I think we should be clear, no foundation, no matter how huge, is in a position to replace all of this foreign assistance that went away. It would wipe out most of us in a single year if we were trying to do that. So what the Rockefeller Foundation has done is focus on sort of putting lights on the runway, which is to give people ideas about how to innovate, how to be more efficient, how to leverage more private capital, how to accomplish many of the goals using new technology, using new innovative financial instruments, using new methods of delivery. And so given that our resources won't replace the money, we're focused on how do we, as I said, light the runway to these solutions and encourage people to get on the runway.
In practical terms, what does that look like?
Some of what we've done, for example, things that I oversee, try to find ways to mobilize private capital for the emerging markets and the developing world. And that has meant bringing institutional investors, just as an example, which are some of the most cautious investors in the world, to a new vision of evaluating risk so that they are prepared to go into developing countries in a way that's more, with their investments in a way that is frankly more. And so we've been working with one of our partners is the Investor Leadership Network, something that the Canadians created. This is a network of institutional investors primarily who are interested in opportunities to look at the emerging markets and developing countries and see whether there are ways to re-examine risk and put their money in investments in those countries. And that would create prosperity. It creates more stability. It creates more opportunities to trade. It creates consumer markets, all of the things that we want in developing countries, both for their benefit and also for the benefit of countries in the developed world. So by doing that, we helped spur, a fund that raised $600 million off of a very small amount of grant and a huge amount of very strategic convenings that tried to have a new conversation about the risks that are involved. So that's just one way. And in other ways, we've been trying to leverage the multilateral development bank, the banks that are out there, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, the Asia Development Bank. All of these banks are in the Bretton Woods system, and they are focused on delivering development projects and development thinking and development strategy to countries and seeding them with funding to do that. And so we've been very focused on how to drive more money or sort of derive more money out of that system in a way that can be strategically invested across the developing world.
So these dire numbers we spoke about, can we reverse course or is that unlikely?
Budget cuts are generally enacted annually. So if you have a different perspective, then yes, you can head in a different direction. And frankly, we think that there are things that happen that sort of don't have immediate recourse. And I'll just give you an example. So the war in Iran with the US and Israel in conflict has driven up petroleum prices, obviously, is in the process of driving up interest rates, has made fertilizers more scarce and more expensive. One of the outcomes of that, of course, is that if you if you borrow money under the higher interest rates, or if you're going to refinance, whatever that length of deal is, you're suddenly locked into those higher interest rates. Like when you say it's reversible, yes, you can refinance, but all of that has a cost. And when you've refinanced at a much higher rate, that's going to continue for a while. The other thing is the fertilizer problem is sort of the most urgent, right? Because if the fertilizer is not available at the right time, you're going to get much, much lower yields. And so food prices go up, food scarcity goes up, food insecurity goes up. So if you have lower fertilizer prices 3 months after the planting season, you're kind of out of luck.
For listeners who may not work directly in global health, what's the one thing you think is important for them to understand about this moment?
I think there would be two, so I'm going to cheat. One is this is going to have immediate consequences, right? When you stop delivering HIV or AIDS medication, these are real people at the end of this pipeline and supply chain, right? Like these are real people at the end of this story that are affected. And the second thing is I'll just go back to what I said earlier, which I think is really important. People get on airplanes every day, and maybe they don't come to the US, but they go to Europe, and then they talk to people who are European and get on planes to US. There's no hiding from global health. There's sort of a axiom in global economics, right? That if the US gets a sniffle, country X gets the flu, right? Our implications are on the economic side, huge. But the fact of the matter is that when a part of the world gets very sick with a communicable disease, it doesn't stay there. And if you look at the Ebola, the United States jumped on that and really was the primary actor in trying to address Ebola in Western Africa. And I recall I was at the White House at the time that people were coming out of those conversations with their hair on fire because the degree of contagion was considerable if it got beyond a certain point. And people were, I think, using the technical term, freaked out, right, by the possibilities. And the result was that we acted quickly and decisively to respond to the health needs, because that's what we need to do, not just to protect West Africans, but to protect Americans. And so I think sometimes we do a great job of explaining what the connection is between us and foreign assistance and why it matters for Americans. And sometimes we do a pretty lousy job of it. And I think ultimately we need to do a better job. And frankly, it's interesting. We're at a time where everybody sort of assumes that the politicians are reacting to political tides and pressure and a unanimous view from Americans. But the fact of the matter is, we did a recent poll last fall that asked globally 34 countries, 36,000 people, whether they were in support of international cooperation, even if it meant making compromises on their own national interests, right? So we didn't ask, what do you think about international cooperation? Isn't it great, right? We asked the question, would you be prepared to support international cooperation, even if it meant trade-offs? And 55% of those 36,000 people said yes, they were in favor of that. And in the US, the number was even higher. I think it was 61%. And so it is not that the politicians are following the people. In fact, you could argue that some of these politicians are actually wildly afield of their voters.
I know the big thing we've talked about is money, but the money that's been taken away. But I guess my last question is about trust. We have broken promises around the world. Can that be rebuilt?
I've actually started to think about this a lot. And I think most of the time you restore trust by actions, reliable actions. And so, I am not of the opinion that the solution is that we go around the world telling people we're going to do better. In this situation, I don't think that's going to be persuasive. I think that the solution is to be better, to actually make commitments and then reliably deliver on them. That means that we have to find ways to stitch up a bipartisan and a broadly popular approach to foreign assistance that is grounded in how it helps make the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous.
Eric Pelofsky, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.